The autumn evening was growing darker as Judge Marcus Thompson's black BMW glided smoothly along Cedar Street. The street lights had just begun to flicker on, casting long shadows across the clean, well-maintained suburban roads. It had been another long day at the federal courthouse, and the 52-year-old judge was looking forward to getting home to his family. Marcus had spent 15 years building his reputation as one of the city's most respected federal judges. His silver-rimmed glasses and neatly pressed dark suit reflected his careful attention to detail, a trait that had served him well throughout his career. Tonight, his suit jacket lay carefully draped across the back seat, his tie loosened just slightly after 12 hours of hearing cases. In his rearview mirror, Marcus noticed the white and blue police cruiser that had been following him for the past 6 blocks. He checked his speedometer, exactly at the speed limit. His hands instinctively tightened on the steering wheel, a familiar tension creeping into his shoulders. Even after all these years, even in his position, he knew what it meant to be a black man driving an expensive car in this neighborhood after dark. Officer James Reynolds sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, his eyes fixed on the BMW ahead. At 34, he had 8 years on the force and a reputation that followed him, though not one he saw as problematic. His supervisor had warned him about his high number of traffic stops involving minorities, but Reynolds always defended his record with the same response. "I don't see color, I see suspicious behavior." The BMW's brake lights glowed red at a stop sign, and Reynolds watched as the driver made a complete, proper stop. Still, something about the car didn't sit right with him. This wasn't the kind of neighborhood where he usually saw black drivers, especially not at this hour. His finger hovered over the light bar control. Marcus felt his heart sink as the red and blue lights suddenly erupted behind him. He'd done nothing wrong, he was sure of it. Carefully, he activated his dashboard camera, a habit he'd developed years ago. As he pulled over to the curb, he also took out his phone and placed it on the passenger seat, making sure its camera was also recording. Following the procedure he'd learned long ago and had to use far too many times, Marcus turned on his interior lights, rolled down his window, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. The cool night air drifted in through the open window as he waited, watching in his side mirror as Officer Reynolds approached. The beam of a flashlight swept across his side mirror, temporarily blinding him. Marcus could make out Reynolds's figure. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a military-style haircut and a stern expression that seemed carved from stone. The officer's right hand rested near his holster, a detail that didn't escape Marcus's notice. "License and registration," Reynolds barked, his flashlight beam now directly on Marcus's face. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Marcus kept his voice steady and calm, despite the familiar anger and humiliation burning in his chest. "Good evening, officer. I live in this neighborhood. May I ask why you pulled me over?" Reynolds's face hardened. "I'll ask the questions here. License and registration now." With slow, deliberate movements, Marcus reached for his glove compartment. "Officer, I'm going to reach for my documents now. They're in my glove box." He narrated each movement, knowing from both personal experience and professional knowledge how quickly these situations could escalate. As he handed over his license and registration, Marcus noticed a flicker of something cross Reynolds's face as the beam of the flashlight illuminated his credentials. Federal judges didn't usually get pulled over for random traffic stops. "Sir, I still haven't been informed of the reason for this stop," Marcus said, his voice carrying the measured tone he used in his courtroom. "Could you please tell me what traffic violation you observed?" Reynolds stood straighter, his jaw tightening. The comfortable authority he usually felt during traffic stops was slipping away, replaced by a growing realization that he might have made a serious mistake. He glanced down at the license again, then back at Marcus, the weight of what he'd done beginning to settle on his shoulders. The night air grew heavier with tension as both men realized this wouldn't be just another traffic stop. For Marcus, it was an all-too-familiar reminder that his position and success didn't shield him from prejudice. For Reynolds, though he didn't know it yet, it was about to become a moment that would force him to confront truths he'd spent years denying. Officer Reynolds shifted his weight from one foot to another, the silence growing uncomfortable as he stared at Judge Thompson's credentials. The gold federal judge badge gleamed under his flashlight beam, seeming to mock his authority. His mind raced to find a legitimate reason for the stop, but he knew he had none. "Step out of the vehicle," Reynolds finally commanded, trying to regain control of the situation. His voice carried less authority now, but old habits died hard. Marcus Thompson took a slow, deep breath. In his years on the bench, he had seen countless cases where routine traffic stops escalated into tragedy. He pressed the record button on his phone's camera app again, ensuring it was still capturing everything. "Officer Reynolds," Marcus spoke clearly, making sure his voice would be picked up by both recording devices. "I respectfully decline to exit my vehicle unless you can provide me with a legitimate reason for this traffic stop. As you can see from my credentials, I am a federal judge, and I know my rights under the law." Reynolds's face flushed red in the darkness. Sweat began to form on his forehead despite the cool evening air. In his 8 years on the force, no one had ever so calmly and professionally challenged his authority. Most people either got angry and defensive or became submissive out of fear. "Sir, I observed your vehicle driving erratically," Reynolds lied, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. He knew his dashcam would prove otherwise, but he felt trapped in a corner of his own making. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression remaining neutral. "Officer, I know your patrol car is equipped with a dashboard camera. So is my vehicle. Additionally, I've been recording this interaction on my phone. Would you like to revise that statement?" A young couple walking their dog passed by slowly, their curious eyes taking in the scene. Reynolds felt exposed, his usual confidence crumbling under the weight of the judge's calm scrutiny. His hand, which had been resting near his weapon, fell limply to his side. "I," Reynolds started, then stopped. For the first time in his career, he found himself at a complete loss for words. Marcus decided to shift the dynamic. In his courtroom, he had learned that moments of high tension often presented the best opportunities for teaching. "Officer Reynolds, what's your badge number and the name of your supervising officer?" Reynolds straightened up automatically. "Badge number 47,831, sir. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez is my supervising officer." "Thank you," Marcus said, pulling out his phone. He opened his contacts and began typing, his fingers moving swiftly across the screen. "Lieutenant Martinez and I served together on the city's police oversight committee. I'm sending her a message right now." Reynolds felt his stomach drop. This traffic stop was quickly becoming a career-defining moment, and not in the way he'd hoped. His mind flashed to his mortgage, his kids' school fees, and his wife's face when he'd tell her he'd lost his job. But Judge Thompson had different plans. However, he continued, looking directly at Reynolds, "I believe this could be an opportunity for something more constructive than a formal complaint." Reynolds blinked in surprise. The judge's tone had shifted from confrontational to contemplative. "Tomorrow morning, I'm presiding over several cases involving police conduct and racial profiling," Marcus explained, his voice taking on the same measured tone he used in his courtroom. "I'd like you to observe these proceedings, Officer Reynolds. Not as punishment, but as an opportunity for perspective." The unexpected offer hung in the night air between them. Reynolds stood frozen, processing the words. He had been bracing for career-ending consequences, not an invitation to court. "Sir, I..." Reynolds paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Are you saying you're not going to file a complaint?" Marcus leaned slightly out of his window, making direct eye contact with the officer. "I've seen enough careers ended over mistakes, Officer Reynolds. What I haven't seen enough of is growth and change. The choice is yours. You can face disciplinary action, or you can take this opportunity to understand why moments like this matter so much." Reynolds lowered his flashlight completely, finally seeing Judge Thompson clearly in the soft glow of the street lights. The man before him wasn't angry or vengeful. He was offering a chance at redemption. "Court starts at 9 a.m., Marcus continued, his tone firm but not unkind. "I trust you can find your way to courtroom 304 without a GPS." The small attempt at humor wasn't lost on Reynolds, who managed a slight, embarrassed smile. "Yes, Your Honor. I'll be there." As Marcus drove away a few minutes later, both men knew that tomorrow would mark the beginning of a significant change, not just for Officer Reynolds, but potentially for the entire department. The next morning arrived with a brightness that felt almost mocking to Officer James Reynolds. He stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his uniform for the 5th time. The dark circles under his eyes told the story of a sleepless night spent replaying yesterday's traffic stop in his mind. His wife, Maria, watched him from the doorway with concern. "James, you've been quiet since you got home last night. What happened during your shift?" Reynolds turned to face her, his shoulders heavy. "I messed up, Maria. I pulled over a federal judge because—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The truth stuck in his throat. "Because he was black?" Maria finished softly. She worried about this day coming, had seen the gradual changes in her husband over his years on the force. At 8:45 a.m., Reynolds walked through the courthouse security checkpoint. Several other officers nodded at him, probably assuming he was there to testify in a case. If they only knew. The marble halls felt longer than usual as he made his way to courtroom 304. Inside, Judge Thompson was already at his bench, reviewing documents for the day's proceedings. He looked up as Reynolds entered, acknowledging him with a subtle nod. "Officer Reynolds, please take a seat in the front row." The courtroom was filling up with lawyers, defendants, and other observers. Reynolds noticed he wasn't the only police officer present. Several others sat scattered throughout the room, some in uniform, others in plain clothes. But he suspected he was the only one there for a lesson in humility. The first case called involved a young black man who had been arrested for suspicious behavior while waiting for a bus. The arresting officer, a veteran with 20 years on the force, testified with complete confidence about his reasonable suspicion. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat as he recognized his own justifications in the officer's words. Judge Thompson listened patiently, his expression neutral. When the officer finished, the judge removed his glasses and leaned forward. "Officer Parker, could you please explain to this court what specific behaviors led to your suspicion?" The veteran officer's certainty began to crack under the judge's careful questioning. By the end of the hearing, it was clear the arrest had been based on nothing more than the young man's race and presence in an affluent neighborhood. Reynolds felt his face grow hot as he recognized the parallel to his own actions. Case after case followed, each one peeling back layers of systemic bias in law enforcement. Reynolds watched as Judge Thompson handled each situation with remarkable patience and fairness, never showing anger, but never letting injustice slide either. During a brief recess, Judge Thompson beckoned Reynolds to approach the bench. The courtroom had emptied except for the bailiff, who maintained a discreet distance. "What are your observations so far, Officer Reynolds?" the judge asked, his tone genuinely curious. Reynolds stood straight, his hands clasped behind his back. "Your Honor, he paused, gathering his thoughts. "I'm seeing patterns I didn't want to acknowledge before. When that last officer testified about his gut feelings about suspicious behavior, I heard myself." Judge Thompson nodded slowly. "It's not easy to confront our own biases, is it?" "No, sir," Reynolds admitted. "I always told myself I was just being a good cop, following my instincts. But seeing it from this side," he gestured at the courtroom around them. "Let me share something with you," Judge Thompson said, leaning forward. 25 years ago, before I wore this robe, I was pulled over 3 times in 1 month in my own neighborhood. Each time, the officer claimed it was routine. Each time, I had to prove I belonged in my own community." Reynolds felt the weight of shame pressing down on his shoulders. "I never thought about it that way, Your Honor. When I pulled you over last night." "You saw what you expected to see," Judge Thompson finished. "But here's what matters now, Officer Reynolds. What will you see tomorrow?" The question hung in the air between them. Through the courtroom windows, Reynolds could see other police officers arriving for the afternoon session, their badges catching the sunlight. Each one carried the same power he did, the same responsibility, and, he now realized, the same potential for both harm and good. "I'd like to learn to see things differently," Reynolds said finally, his voice firm with newfound conviction. "Not just for today, but for every traffic stop, every interaction." Judge Thompson smiled for the first time that day. "Then perhaps last night's unfortunate encounter will serve a greater purpose than either of us initially imagined." 1 year after the traffic stop that changed 2 lives, Judge Marcus Thompson stood at a podium in the City Hall's main conference room. The room was packed with police officers, community leaders, journalists, and citizens. Officer James Reynolds sat in the front row, his wife Maria beside him, both beaming with pride. "Today, we're not just launching a program," Judge Thompson began, his voice carrying through the crowded room. We're starting a movement that we call Breach the Gap. What began as a traffic stop has grown into something none of us could have imagined. On the screen behind him, statistics told a powerful story. In the past year, their police department had seen a 70% reduction in complaints about racial profiling. Traffic stop data showed more balanced enforcement across all neighborhoods, but more importantly, community trust was growing. Reynolds thought back to the changes he'd witnessed over the past year. His training program had spread beyond their department. 5 other cities had already adopted it, but the real success stories were in the small, daily interactions that would never make the news. Last week, he watched one of his trained officers handle a situation that could have gone badly wrong. A teenage boy had been reported for suspicious behavior outside a convenience store. Instead of rushing in with assumptions, the officer had approached calmly, learned the boy was waiting for his mother who worked inside, and ended up helping him with his math homework while he waited. Judge Thompson continued his speech. Officer Reynolds and I could have let that night end differently. I could have filed a complaint. He could have remained defensive. Instead, we chose to build something together. The judge gestured to a group of young officers in the audience. These 20 officers are our first official class of Breach the Gap mentors. They'll work with community members to create understanding where there was fear, dialogue where there was silence. Reynolds smiled at the young officers. He had personally trained each one, sharing not just techniques but his own story of transformation. Among them was Officer Chen, who had gone from rookie to one of the program's strongest advocates. Maria squeezed her husband's hand as Judge Thompson began describing the program's next phase. They both knew how much work had gone into this moment. Late nights reviewing training materials, weekend community meetings, countless conversations with officers resistant to change. But it had all been worth it. Our children deserve a world where they're not afraid of those sworn to protect them, Judge Thompson continued. Our officers deserve the tools and training to serve without the burden of unconscious bias. Our communities deserve the chance to trust again. The new initiatives were ambitious: regular community dialogue sessions, ride-along programs for citizens, implicit bias training starting at the police academy level, and monthly meetings where officers could share their challenges and successes openly. After the presentation, people mingled in small groups, sharing stories and ideas. Reynolds watched as his teenage son talked animatedly with a black student from the youth advisory board they created. A year ago, these conversations wouldn't have seemed possible. Later that evening, Reynolds and Judge Thompson stood in the parking lot, just like they had a year ago, but under very different circumstances. Did you ever imagine this? Reynolds asked, looking back at the building where people were still talking and planning. Judge Thompson smiled. Actually, I did. The moment you agreed to come to my courtroom that first day, I knew there was hope. Real change doesn't come from punishment. It comes from understanding. Reynolds nodded, thinking about all the lives that had been touched by their work. You know what my daughter said yesterday? She told me she's proud to tell her friends I'm a police officer. A year ago, she was worried about what her black friends would think. That's the real measure of success, Judge Thompson replied, when our children can see the change we're creating. As they prepared to leave, a young black officer approached them. Sir, he addressed Reynolds. I just wanted to say, your story inspired me to join the force. I wanted to be part of this change. Reynolds felt his throat tighten with emotion. He remembered Judge Thompson's words from a year ago about Officer Miller, a man who had changed his life decades earlier. Now he understood what it meant to be part of that legacy. The work isn't finished, Judge Thompson said, looking at both men. But every step forward makes the next one easier. The afternoon session of court had just ended when Judge Thompson invited Officer Reynolds to his chambers. The wood-paneled room felt warm and intimidating at the same time, with walls lined with law books and framed photographs showing the judge with various community leaders and presidents. Reynolds sat in a leather chair across from the judge's desk, his police cap held nervously in his hands. The events of the day had left him mentally exhausted, but somehow more awake than ever to things he'd been blind to before. Officer Reynolds, Judge Thompson began, settling into his chair, I saw you taking notes during today's proceedings. Would you share your thoughts? Reynolds pulled out his small notepad, his handwriting messier than usual due to his shaking hands. Your Honor, I counted 17 cases today. In 12 of them, the arrests were made based on what officers called suspicious behavior. But when you asked for specific details, he paused, swallowing hard. Most of us couldn't give any real reason except that the person looked out of place. Judge Thompson nodded, pleased at the officer's observation. And what does out of place usually mean in these situations? Being black or Hispanic in a wealthy neighborhood, Reynolds admitted, the words bitter in his mouth. Just like when I stopped you last night. The judge leaned forward, placing his elbows on his desk. Officer Reynolds, I'm going to make you an unusual proposal. Lieutenant Martinez and I discussed your situation this morning. Instead of filing a formal complaint, I have something else in mind. Reynolds sat up straighter, hope mixing with anxiety in his chest. I want you to spend the next month working with me on a special project, Judge Thompson continued. 3 days a week, you'll observe different courtrooms handling cases involving police interactions. But here's the real challenge. I want you to help create a training program for other officers based on what you learn. Reynolds blinked in surprise. A training program, sir? Yes, you see, filing a complaint against you might satisfy some need for punishment, but it wouldn't create change. You're not the first officer to make these mistakes, and you won't be the last unless we do something to break the cycle. Through the office window, Reynolds could see the sun setting over the city skyline. The same streets he patrolled for 8 years suddenly looked different to him. How many times had he made assumptions? How many lives had he impacted without even realizing it? But why me, Your Honor? Reynolds asked. After what I did, why would you trust me with something this important? Judge Thompson smiled, reaching for a framed photo on his desk. He handed it to Reynolds, who saw a younger version of the judge standing next to an older white police officer. That's Officer Frank Miller, the judge explained. 30 years ago, he pulled me over for the same reason you did, driving while black. But instead of writing me a ticket or making excuses, he admitted his mistake. Then he spent the next 20 years working to change the department from within. He became my mentor, my friend, and eventually, best man at my wedding. Reynolds studied the photo, seeing the genuine friendship between the two men. What happened to him? He retired 5 years ago, but his legacy lives on in the officers he trained. Sometimes, Officer Reynolds, our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest opportunities for change. The question is, are you willing to take on this challenge? Reynolds looked at the photo again, then back at the judge. In the past 24 hours, his world had been turned upside down. Everything he thought he knew about being a good police officer had been challenged. But instead of feeling defensive or angry, he felt something else: hope. Yes, Your Honor, he said firmly. I want to be part of the solution. Judge Thompson extended his hand across the desk. Then let's begin. Tomorrow, you'll start by reviewing body camera footage from traffic stops across the department. We'll analyze patterns, identify triggers, and develop strategies for better decision-making. As they shook hands, both men understood that this was more than just a training program. It was a chance to bridge gaps, challenge assumptions, and create real change in their community. For Reynolds, it was the beginning of a journey that would reshape not just his career, but his entire understanding of what it meant to protect and serve. 1 week into his special assignment, Officer Reynolds sat in courtroom 304 with a fresh perspective. Today was different from his previous observations. He wasn't just watching cases, he was taking an active role in analyzing police testimony. His notebook was already half full of observations, and the morning session hadn't even ended. The case before Judge Thompson involved a teenager named Marcus Johnson, arrested for resisting arrest during what should have been a routine jaywalking stop. The arresting officer, a rookie named Peterson, stood at the witness stand, confidently describing the incident. The suspect displayed aggressive behavior when approached. Officer Peterson testified, his chin held high. He reached for his waistband, and I feared for my safety. Reynolds watched as Judge Thompson reviewed the body camera footage on the courtroom screen. The video told a different story. It showed a scared 16-year-old boy reaching for his school ID, his hands shaking as he tried to explain he was late for his SAT prep class. Officer Peterson, Judge Thompson spoke calmly, posing the video. Could you point out the aggressive behavior you mentioned? The young officer's confidence wavered. Reynolds felt a familiar discomfort as he recognized the same mistakes he had made countless times, seeing threat where there was only fear, assuming guilt where there was only confusion. During the lunch break, Reynolds sat in the courthouse cafeteria, pushing his sandwich around his plate. An older black woman approached his table, her eyes red from crying. "You're one of the police officers, aren't you?" she asked quietly. Reynolds nodded, noticing she was clutching a tissue. "Yes, ma'am. Is everything all right?" "I just wanted to thank you," she said, surprising him. "I was in court this morning. I saw you shaking your head during that young officer's testimony about Marcus. That's my grandson." Reynolds felt his throat tighten. "Please, sit down," he'd offered, pulling out a chair. "Marcus is a good boy," she continued, sitting down heavily. "Honor roll student, never been in trouble. But ever since that arrest, he's been having nightmares. He doesn't want to walk to school anymore." Reynolds thought about his own children at home, trying to imagine them being afraid to walk down their own street. "Ma'am, I'm sorry about what happened to your grandson. I'm here because I'm learning to be a better officer, to help prevent things like this from happening." The grandmother smiled sadly. "It's not just about being better officers. It's about seeing us as people first. Not suspects, not statistics, just people trying to live our lives like everyone else." Back in the courtroom that afternoon, Reynolds watched Judge Thompson handle a series of cases involving police testimony. Each time, the judge masterfully exposed the gaps between perception and reality, between assumed threat and actual behavior. One case particularly struck Reynolds. An officer had arrested a black father for suspicious behavior while he was taking photos of his own house. The man was documenting renovations for his insurance company, but a neighbor's call about a suspicious person had escalated into an arrest. Judge Thompson asked the officer a simple question. "If this had been a white man taking pictures of his house in that neighborhood, would you have responded the same way?" The silence that followed was deafening. At the end of the day, Reynolds stayed behind to help Judge Thompson organize case files. His mind was swimming with everything he witnessed. "Your Honor," he said, sorting through papers, "I keep thinking about something Marcus Johnson's grandmother told me today, about seeing people as people first." Judge Thompson smiled. "That's exactly what this program is about, Officer Reynolds. Every person who comes through that door has a story, a family, dreams, and fears. Our job, yours as an officer, mine as a judge, is to remember that before we make any judgments." Reynolds nodded, picking up his notebook. "I've been reviewing my own traffic stops from the past year. The patterns are disturbing." "Recognition is the first step toward change," Judge Thompson replied. "Tomorrow, we'll start working on specific strategies to help officers check their biases before they act. But for now, I want you to go home and think about one question. What would policing look like if we approached every situation assuming the best about people instead of the worst?" As Reynolds drove home that evening, he passed the spot where he pulled over Judge Thompson just days ago. That moment of prejudice had led him here, to a place of uncomfortable but necessary growth. He realized that true justice wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about seeing the humanity in every person, regardless of their appearance or circumstances. After 2 weeks of intensive courtroom observations, Judge Thompson invited Officer Reynolds to join him for dinner at Carter's, a small family restaurant near the courthouse. The evening crowd was thin, and they found a quiet booth in the corner where they could talk privately. Reynolds noticed how the other diners reacted to their unusual pairing, a white police officer and a black judge sharing a meal. Some stared openly, while others quickly looked away. He was beginning to understand how it felt to be watched, to have people make assumptions about you. "Try the pot roast," Judge Thompson suggested, setting down his menu. "Mrs. Carter has been making it the same way for 30 years. As they waited for their food, Reynolds gathered his courage to ask the question that had been bothering him. "Your Honor, can I ask you something personal?" The judge nodded, stirring his coffee. "Of course." "How do you do it? Stay so calm when dealing with officers who clearly acted on prejudice. If I were in your position, after everything you've experienced." Judge Thompson was quiet for a moment, looking out the restaurant window at the passing traffic. "Let me tell you a story, James. May I call you James?" Reynolds nodded, surprised by the personal touch. 20 years ago, my son was 16, the judge began. He had just gotten his driver's license. One night, He was driving home from basketball practice when he got pulled over. The officer was aggressive, pulled him out of the car, handcuffed him on the sidewalk. All because someone had reported a suspicious vehicle in the neighborhood. Reynolds felt his face grow hot with shame, thinking of similar stops he had conducted. When he finally got home, he was crying. Judge Thompson continued, his voice steady but filled with old pain, not from physical hurt, but from the humiliation, from realizing that no matter how well he did in school, no matter how polite he was, some people would always see him as a threat first. Their food arrived, but neither man touched it immediately. I had a choice then, the judge said. I could let anger consume me, or I could work to create change. I chose the harder path, to stay in the system and try to fix it from within. That's why I became a judge. Reynolds thought about his own children at home. I keep thinking about how I would feel if someone treated my kids the way I've treated others. It makes me sick to my stomach. Good, Judge Thompson said firmly. That feeling means you're changing. But guilt without action is useless. What matters is what you do with that understanding. They began eating, the pot roast living up to its reputation. Between bites, Reynolds shared his own revelations from the past 2 weeks. Yesterday, I was reviewing my old body camera footage, he said. I watched myself get aggressive with a man because he questioned why I pulled him over. At the time, I thought I was just being firm, maintaining control. Now I see how scared he was, how I made things worse by escalating. Judge Thompson nodded. Fear works both ways, James. Officers are trained to be afraid, to always expect the worst. But that fear becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you approach every situation expecting danger, you create tension that didn't need to exist. How do we change that? Reynolds asked, genuinely seeking answers. It starts with conversations like this one, the judge replied. With being willing to see things from other perspectives. With admitting our mistakes and learning from them. As they finished their meal, Mrs. Carter herself came to their table. She was an elderly black woman with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. Judge Thompson, she smiled warmly, then looked at Reynolds with curiosity. An officer, this is a new face. Officer Reynolds is helping me with a special project, Martha, the judge explained. We're working on building bridges. Mrs. Carter's smile widened. Well, it's about time. We need more of that in this city. She patted both men's shoulders before walking away. As they left the restaurant, Reynolds felt different, lighter somehow, despite the heavy conversations. He understood now that this wasn't just about changing his own behavior. It was about being part of a larger change, about helping other officers see what he had finally begun to see. Same time tomorrow? Judge Thompson asked as they reached their cars. Yes, Your Honor, Reynolds replied, then corrected himself. Yes, Marcus. I'll be there. 3 months after that fateful traffic stop, Officer James Reynolds stood before a room full of police officers at the department's monthly training session. His hands were steady as he set up his presentation, though his heart was beating fast. Among the audience, he spotted Judge Thompson sitting quietly in the back row, offering an encouraging nod. Good morning, everyone, Reynolds began, his voice stronger than he expected. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be standing here giving a presentation about racial bias in policing, I probably would have laughed, or gotten angry, or both. A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Reynolds recognized that defensive posture. He'd worn it himself not so long ago. But 3 months ago, I made a traffic stop that changed everything, he continued. I pulled over a black man in an expensive car because, and let's be honest here, he didn't fit what I thought belonged in that neighborhood. The room was silent now, all eyes fixed on him. Reynolds clicked to his first slide, showing his own body camera footage from that night. That man turned out to be Federal Judge Marcus Thompson, who's here with us today. But here's the thing, his title shouldn't matter. What I did was wrong, whether he was a judge, a doctor, a teacher, or a student. Over the next hour, Reynolds shared everything he'd learned. He showed traffic stop statistics from their own department, revealing patterns that couldn't be explained away. He played body camera footage from his own past stops, analyzing his language, his assumptions, his escalations. Look at this footage, he said, playing a video from 6 months ago. Listen to how I speak to this young black woman. Now, compare it to this stop of a white businessman from the same week. The difference is clear, and it's not about their behavior. It's about my assumptions. In the back of the room, Lieutenant Martinez watched with pride. She remembered how skeptical she'd been when Judge Thompson first proposed this program instead of filing a complaint against Reynolds. Now she understood his wisdom. Reynolds moved on to the practical part of his presentation. We developed new protocols for traffic stops, he explained, distributing handouts. But more importantly, we've created a system for checking our own biases before we act. He shared the simple but effective checklist he developed with Judge Thompson. Would I make this stop if the driver was a different race? Can I articulate a specific violation, not just a feeling? Am I responding to actual behavior or to assumptions? How would I want my own family member to be treated in this situation? Some of the older officers looked resistant, but Reynolds saw many of the younger ones taking notes. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but it had to start somewhere. After the presentation, Officer Sarah Chen, a rookie Reynolds had been mentoring, approached him. "That was brave," she said. "I've been struggling with some of these issues but didn't know how to bring them up." Reynolds smiled, remembering his own journey. "The hardest part is admitting we need to change. The rest is just work." Later that afternoon, Reynolds was back on patrol, but everything felt different. He saw the community through new eyes, not as potential threats to be controlled, but as people to be protected and served. Driving through his usual route, he passed a black teenager walking home from school. 6 months ago, he might have slowed down, watched the kids suspiciously. Today, he waved and got a surprised smile in return. His radio crackled with a call about a suspicious person in an upscale neighborhood. Reynolds took the call, but as he drove there, he remembered his checklist. When he arrived and found a black woman taking photos of a house, his approach was different from what it would have been before. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said warmly, keeping his distance to avoid appearing threatening. "I'm Officer Reynolds. We got a call from a neighbor. Are you photographing your house?" The woman tensed at first, then relaxed at his friendly tone. "Yes, I'm a real estate agent. This is my new listing." She reached for her business card. "That's great," Reynolds replied. "Would you like me to speak with the neighbor who called? Sometimes people make assumptions they shouldn't." The woman's surprise turned to appreciation. "Thank you, officer. That would be helpful." As Reynolds walked to the neighbor's house, he felt the weight of his badge differently now. It wasn't just a symbol of authority anymore. It was a reminder of his responsibility to protect everyone's dignity and rights, regardless of their appearance or address.